Welcome to the Face to Face podcast, your go to resource for living a life of vitality, wholeness, and authenticity. I am one of your hosts, Melinda Wilson.
And I'm your other host, Kathy Little. Join us as we explore deeper connection, lasting freedom, and meaningful relationships with God, others, and your true self. Let's dive in. Hey, everybody, welcome back.
We're glad that you're here for episode 177.
Yes.
And Kathy, what exciting things do you have to share?
Yeah, really quick. If you have already participated in a Foundations Level 1 Emmanuel Approach for Life basic course, you can apply for Level 2, and enrollment is open until December 15th. So if you're interested, you've already got the basics, you've done a Foundations, come on and join us in Level 2. That deadline is December 15th. And if you haven't done a basic Level 1, your chance is coming January 15th because we're going to run it again, 7 weeks. It's a hybrid course where there's some things you watch on your own time, and then we have live Q&A and practicum, and get to do this in the context of community, exploring the Emmanuel Approach basics for your life in a very practical way. So that registration is open now too at emmanuelinstitute.com, spelled with an I. Both of those courses are available right now. So we just want to make sure you guys know to hop into that. And while you're there, you're going to see information about our Understanding Trauma course, which is really pretty unique. A bunch of the biggest voices in trauma-informed care in one place for you guys. Self-paced, you do that all in your own time, but that is also available. So emmanuelinstitute.com, we'd love to have you join us. And we have another fantastic guest. Melinda, tell me, this one's a big one. I'm excited about this one.
Yeah, it is broken into two parts. There's so much here with Michael John Cusick, and he does introduce himself, but he is an author and a podcaster himself, and used to be a professor at a couple different universities and seminaries, and his story is quite remarkable.
Yeah.
He is really a walking, living miracle, and we had an incredible time. It was a deep honor to be with him, and we're so excited to introduce you to Michael John Cusick. And even if you've heard him before, you haven't heard him being interviewed by us. So
right.
I am excited to welcome Michael John Cusick to the Face to Face podcast.
Michael, I have listened to your podcast on many of occasions. We've interviewed some of the same people along the way. I just was looking through the list really quick. You interviewed Brad Jersak. I'm actually a student of his at St. Stephen's University right now and doing my master's.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I just got back from a week-long residency in New Brunswick, and I'll tell you, they're my people. It's so wonderful to be with people. This is the way I describe it, that everybody really loves Jesus and they love each other well, and there's no religious at all. It's just really a beautiful community that just loves really well. And I'm delighted to be there. But yeah, we've got a lot of people, the Gaultiers, we've also interviewed them and others. But there's so many things that you have addressed in your podcast and so many things that you're about. And we're just excited for our audience to get to know who you are, what makes you tick, what is it that you do? Because we are all about helping people connect more with Jesus and experience what that means. And I know you're in the same line of work. So introduce our folks to you.
It's always fun to hear when people listen to the podcast. This is a one-way medium, just like writing books. And unless I'm out somewhere speaking to a group, you don't often hear a lot about the podcast. And I'm delighted to hear about your connection, Kathy, with Brad Jersak and St. Stephen's. Brad is a dear, dear brother. We talk monthly. I call him my theologian and pastor on retainer, where we talk no matter what. And I usually ask him a bunch of questions, and they are a Jesus-loving group without all the baggage. And you don't often see that, because oftentimes when people throw the baggage overboard, they lose the centrality and passion for Jesus, and even the expectation that we can actually have union with God and still have an inner life that is substantive and alive. So glad. And that allows me to exhale with both of you. It's okay. You're my people. So
yes, indeed.
So my story, I have a number of different professional bios depending on where I go. And one of my favorite ones was accidental. And somebody asked me, quick, send me a bio. And I said that I was the youngest of 5 in an Irish Catholic family. I attended my first alcoholics meeting when I was 5 years old. I went into a family drug rehab program when I was age 9, and I lived in a trailer. And then went to my first psychiatrist when I was 16 years old, and that psychiatrist sexually abused me. So that set me up for a life as a psychotherapist. And there is a lot of tragedy and pathos in my story, which I've had to work through and continue to work through. And yet it's really been really redemptive, where I believe that despite whatever training, degrees, and gifts that I've been given, that the secret sauce to my life from the time I get up in the morning until the time I go to bed at night is the brokenness that I've had to wrestle through, and the suffering that I've encountered through, some of it my fault, some of it not my fault. But it's in that I've encountered the reality of who God is, that has just stripped away a lot of the nonsense and a lot of the non-essentials. And as a therapist, a professor, spiritual director, what I happen to do is to put words to that experience so that other people can benefit from that. But as you indicated, I did unpack a bit of my story in the first chapter of Sacred Attachment, where I had been in a couple different documentaries. There's a documentary called Boys, about boys who have been sexually abused and trafficked, and a couple of others on trafficking. But I've never written about that part of my story. And so when I was 4 years old, an uncle began to sexually abuse me, and he was quite sadistic in addition to being a pedophile, and then made me available to other men in the community. And so, never knowing that that was actually trafficking until somebody asked me to come speak at a trafficking conference. And I said, "Why do you want me to speak at this?" And they said, "Because of your story." And it just hit me like literally in this phone call. The blood drained out of my face. My heart started to race. And I had known those details, but I'd never put that word to it. That was about 15 years ago. And I had to start digging deeper and beginning to process all of that. So, in sharing that, I would say that it takes a very, very long time for real transformation to happen and for healing to happen, sometimes longer than we would choose. But Jesus is the real resource, the real person, and the real place that we can go to in the midst of our deepest brokenness and our darkest moments.
Wow. Yeah, it's wild how perspective and having somebody put language on something can be the thing that like opens the door. Like somebody put language on what you had experienced, and I've had that happen with me with some of the things where I talk about it as like it was a normal thing, and somebody else had to hold the mirror up and say, "Hey, wait a minute, that's not okay."
Yes.
But it's actually propelled you forward into doing a lot of work with people who have experienced sexual brokenness and many other things as well, right? What is it that you are doing now? Tell us about Restoring the Soul.
The primary thing I do, my ministry base is Restoring the Soul, and we are an intensive counseling ministry in Denver, Colorado. I started doing this work of intensive counseling in the late 90s, when a local person who had worked with pastors called me up one day and said, "I've got a guy coming for 2 weeks. We go for walks every morning, and then we talk about ministry planning. He needs therapy. Would you meet with him every day for 3 hours for 2 weeks during the time he's going to be here?" And I had never heard of that before. But I was a professor at the time, and they let me counsel out of that office, and I had great flexibility. So I did that. And what I saw happen in that 2 weeks, by meeting every day where you didn't start over a week or two later, it was really profound and transformational. It allowed me to integrate things like spiritual direction and even some inner healing, prayer. And the idea was born out of that. So since 2002, we've been a nonprofit, and we help people get unstuck in places where they've been to, one, two, three, four, five counselors as a couple or as an individual, not really knowing what the issue is, but hoping that somehow they discover that. And when they come here, we give them clarity about what the issues are and a way to move forward, and then some actual healing all along the way. And it's been transformational. We've worked with probably close to 2,000 people or couples. We've had people from over 60 countries come, and that's what I love doing. I think I'll always be involved in some aspect of that intensive work. But at heart, I'm a teacher and a shepherd. And so I integrate all of that into what I do. And yeah, I really have been able to take the brokenness and pass on the gold that I've gleaned from that.
Hmm.
How does that play out for you, Michael, your own path and journey into what you do? How has that formed and shaped you to be a more, I don't know, I should say, I won't try to put words in your mouth. How has it formed and shaped you, your own background of brokenness in helping other people?
I think on the obvious level, the tip of the iceberg, if you will, it can give me and does give me a sense of compassion for others. On the Enneagram, I'm a 2. I'm a helper, giver. I naturally gravitate toward caring for others. However, I have Asperger's, so I'm on the autism spectrum, and I can have great compassion almost as a superpower for people that are sitting in front of me as clients. But then I go home, and because of the neurodiversity, my wife is neurotypical, and we have 2 neurodiverse children. It can be as if we're speaking different languages sometimes. So even in what I would say is one of my greatest vocational gifts of compassion and seeing people, there's a vulnerability and a limitation that I have in terms of my most important relationships. And so I would say that I have healthy relationships with my wife and my kids, but our marriage has had a lot of challenges in addition to my sex addiction that was exposed 31 years ago. That was part of my brokenness and part of our story. There's always a sense of weakness that's woven into to almost everything I do. So I'm not denying that I have gifts, skills, talents, and abilities, but at the end of the day, there is truly, as Brene Brown talks about, a power in vulnerability and a power in proclaiming my weakness.
Hmm.
There's a ministry called True Face, and I'll actually be speaking at their national conference this weekend, which is here in Denver. Thankfully, it's here in Denver where I live. And years ago, 2 men founded it, Bruce McNichol and Bill Thrall. And Bill is now 87 years old, and he's the first podcast I ever did before there were podcasts. But he would talk about the power of vulnerability, weakness, and humility in Christian leaders in particular. And he would go in back in the heyday of kind of the early Willow Creek church, and everybody was wanting to be big and sexy and mega church, seeker sensitive. And he had access because of some of his business background to some of these great leaders. And he would say on day one, tell me what your values are. And they'd say things like, excellence, and we want to be, A plus and things like that. And he'd get to the end and he'd say he never met a church or a group of leaders who said one of their values was humility. And at the risk of sounding like I'm one of the most humble people I know, which would of course be not humility, that as Bill talked about that in his writings and as I had time to spend with him, I just said, Lord, help me to live and move in humility, which for me is not hard in one sense. And I can be in a moment as proud, arrogant, egocentric, and self-centered as anybody else. But how they defined humility actually came from an old Thomas Merton quote. And Merton said that humility is being precisely who you are at any given time before God and one other person. And I thought, wow, I can do that. I've had a lot of moments of being exposed, and I've learned that in the midst of me being precisely who I am, thinking that who I am was unworthy, unlovable, rejectable, surely people would pour contempt and shame on me in those states, from being found out as a sex addict in my marriage and an alcoholic and a liar to moments of recalling sexual abuse or those moments themselves. Oh, I've learned that love remains. And then in the darkest places that there's a person, and in that place where that person is, there's a place inside of me where love remains. And that's why I use the refrain throughout the book, Sacred Attachment: love has you, love has you, love has you. God is love, therefore God, love has you. And humility is it's like the superpower. It's the secret sauce where God says 3 times in the New Testament that he opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. And the religious word grace is just gift. So if we trust God or others with who we actually are, there's a gift waiting. And I try to take that very, very seriously, which means that I hopefully will quickly be receptive when others share with me that I am arrogant, self-centered, egocentric, etc. Humility isn't the absence of those things, but the ability to tell the truth about it and to stay engaged in loving relationship.
Hmm.
That's so important.
That's powerful.
It's really not modeled Michael, at all that I've seen, at least, of authenticity. And honestly, I'm reading Elizabeth Gilbert's newest book, All the Way to the River, right now, and very, well known, famous author, Eat, Pray, Love. And the reason I mention that, Michael, is because I'm finding her to be the most authentic, vulnerable person that I've heard. Like within the Christian circle, without, and because I mean, you kind of sound like her. She shares from this really authentic place, not to say, "Oh, I've done all these things," almost like a badge of honor or victimization. But when she talks, it's like from that place of humility, like you're saying, Michael, and it's leadership of this is how we can be authentic and vulnerable, but we're not like throwing up on people. We're saying this is
Right.
where I'm at. I still go to therapy. I still go to 12 step. I mean, this is her story. And it makes her more compelling because of that humility and not an identity, a victim identity. And so I wonder what is keeping, I mean, I can answer, but I want to know your answer, Michael. What keeps people in the church specifically? Because it seems like everyone else does it. Brene Brown, Elizabeth Gilbert, these other authors, but within the church, what is keeping people from modeling that true authenticity, vulnerability, where a leader can stand up and go, I'm still struggling with this. I go to a 12-step program. ABC, and holding those things in tension of, yeah, I am healed and I'm also being healed.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, and I want to try to take a little bit different tack from. It's very easy for me to attack the church and to attack leaders and to say, they don't, or Christianity doesn't. And, there are obviously many, many problematic issues theologically, ecclesiologically, culturally, with the church and Christianity. But I won't go there because I think people are hungry for more. And for me, when I hear those responses, although they can come quickly, they they make me angry and bitter and cynical, and I'm too easily a cynic, and I've asked Jesus even today to help me not be a cynic, and to roll my eyes at childlike faith. At the end of the day, I think that humility is hard because it requires, dependence, and all vulnerability requires dependence. And so when Jesus said, uh, that we can't enter the kingdom unless we become like little children. First thing there, many people hear whenever Jesus talks about entering the kingdom, they hear where we will go when we die. We will die and go to heaven. Whenever Jesus is referring to the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God and entering that, he's not talking about a salvation experience. He's not talking about what happens when we die. The kingdom of God is heaven happening here, heaven happening in me. And he's saying, if you want that, and what does that kingdom look like inside of me and inside of you and your listeners? It looks like love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, da 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 da. And it looks like connectedness. It looks like vibrant, overflowing vitality and relationality. In other words, it looks like the Trinity. And it looks like holiness, the kind of holiness that's not like the church lady, but the kind of holiness that makes you lean in and feel compelled to get closer to it. Because holiness is always gravitational, it draws us in, it's not centrifugal and pushes us away. So, becoming like a little child is to be vulnerable, which is to admit our limitations, to admit our not knowing everything, to accept things on the basis of that there's something just internal in our sensibilities that's true or right or good. That's why children are so vulnerable to abuse, right? Is that especially when somebody comes along and grooms them, they take advantage of that natural trusting ability. They take advantage of that childlike sense of wonder and awe at a grown up. But for the church to do this requires that we take very seriously our humanity, meaning that the gospel and the effect of being a follower of Jesus was never meant to diminish our humanity or to make us less human, but to actually make us more human, more fully human. we've all heard the quote from Saint Irenaeus, who said that the glory of God is a human being fully alive, right? Not less human and more godlike, but more human and therefore more fully alive. So there's something about churches that have learned the language of vulnerability from authors like Brene Brown, but it's very hard for that to play out in community because leaders need to have an open hand, and leaders need to have done their own work of looking at if the opposite of pride is humility, then we have to think about pride not as arrogance or haughtiness, but really self-sufficiency. And I think we've become a very self-sufficient church in the West where we can do things as well as any corporation. We can have marketing strategies that are effective in drawing people in. And oftentimes, I wonder, church X, Y, or Z, or this ministry or something, how are they any different from the Rotary Club, in the center of my town? What are they doing that's different? What is it that's of the divine that's being offered? So those are just some initial thoughts. I'll probably keep talking unless you ask another question, and I'm not sure that'll be a good thing.
What you just said about the importance of doing your own work, that whole piece right there is so key. And actually, I'm taking a counseling course at SSU right now, and the professor made a statement that you can teach somebody how to be a counselor in a relatively short amount of time, but the reason it takes so long to get licensed and released to do it is to make that person safe. And I'm like,
Yes.
okay, that's doing your work. And I just have written a paper this week on power and misconduct and understanding power differentials and understanding ethics. And my take on it is, you can put all these external ethical things in practice, but unless you're dealing with the inner landscape of your soul and doing your own work, then you still have that element of potentially being unsafe and causing a lot of harm. So I'm glad that you said that. That's something really important to us, even as we train Emmanuel approach practitioners. That's our inner healing model. And we train folks in that. And we don't just train methodology, but we invite them into their own healing journey and learning relational skills and filling maturity gaps along the way, because that's what makes us safe for somebody else to be with. So I'm glad you brought that up. It's right in the front of my head right now.
Well, and I would love to have a conversation sometime on how you even help people to identify those maturity gaps, because that's the hard work and for leaders, whether that's people that are leading by serving with the Emmanuel ministry or whether it's people that are running churches, most of us have pretty profound blindness around maturity gaps. And, I've been a licensed therapist 32 years, and I've spent, I won't tell you how much money I've spent in therapy and counseling for myself and in my marriage. And at this moment, I have, maturity gaps that I'm not aware of, blind spots. And that's why we need to pray Ephesians 1:18 about open the eyes of my heart so that I would know the hope to which I'm called, and so that I can understand more of the nuances of how my heart has been shaped and how my story has led me to being deceived and deceiving myself and living with autonomy instead of healthy independence. That's so wonderful that you're doing that, because that really is the key. The kind of therapy that people are doing anymore, even in the secular world, that is more and more embodied and somatic, you can't fake that. You have to have a presence about you that is a non-anxious presence. And I think we're going to see a greater and greater divide in mental health in the future. I'm engaged in some conversation with some peers about this, but how we feel and what we're doing as mental health practitioners that have gone to school for years, with the idea that you can be a layperson and hopefully take a very substantial training course and do the personal work. And no offense to people in their 20s, because there are some people that are really gifted in their 20s, but you have to live life and have the crap beaten out of you to actually be able to sit with people in the midst of their worst suffering and to be a non-anxious presence. Yay that you're doing that. And may the programs that are training lay people really be committed to the personal development aspect. Not all counseling programs are, the best ones are, but we simply can't afford anymore to have people that, whether professional or lay people, that are not bringing a non-anxious presence where their own junk and their own story and their own brokenness is coming up and out, and then re-traumatizing or causing more pain.
So
And Michael,
true.
I think a big piece of that is that people just aren't self-aware. And I know that's a buzzword, but man, aware of the blind spots, like you said, and that often requires doing life with someone where you're triggered all the time, and then you can look at that, and then also having people, whether it's a therapist, a counselor, a good friend that has the maturity to mirror to you. I have people in my life, I say, tell me my blind spots, and it doesn't always feel good. And it's, Mel, you're doing it again, or you're saying it again. I'm like, oh yeah, I asked you to point that out. And yet it is the biggest gift. I know not everybody has that. So if you don't, go to a therapist or something and get some help. But there's a couple things that you were talking about that are evoking some questions. And I know Kathy feels the same. We could talk to you all day because your book is so rich too.
Yes.
But we're talking about embodiment, and I'm finding, honestly, Michael, that's imperative actually for the full healing and not just having this lovely sort of more psychological experience. I'm actually teaching some somatic work to our students because it has to be embodied. But I wanted to just ask you about that because your book does touch on trauma and embodiment. And then how do we tell the difference between God's voice or having an experience with God and his love, and then trauma's voice in our nervous system, especially when those kind of have been tangled and sort of codependent. We can be codependent with Jesus and certainly have spiritual bypassing experience from the church. And so how do we begin then, Michael, to heal our nervous system, recognizing whether I'm having an experience with God or if, does that make sense? Like, how do we tell the difference between God's voice and then trauma's voice in our body and nervous system?
Yeah, and I would even include in that question, how do we tell the difference between trauma and spiritual warfare? And I don't want to open up a whole can of worms there, but
No,
for
that's a good
me, a
can of
lot of
worms
the
to open.
healing that I okay, yeah, the question about hearing God's voice and living in a deeply embodied way as God's beloved, there is no spirituality in Christ apart from embodied spirituality. For me, the word spirituality, the embodied aspect of that, the physical aspect of that, the internal experience that we feel in our cells and our neurons. Neurons are cells, so that's redundant. But that otherwise, it's religion or it's cognitive assent to something. And number one, I don't know if that can save us, but it's certainly not helpful. So whether or not saying a prayer or believing certain religious things about God, whether that saves us, I think anybody that wants Jesus will have Jesus. But the embodied experience is what the saints, going all the way back to the early disciples, knew what was both the birthright of followers of Jesus and children of God, but also what was absolutely essential to live in this world as an alive person who's awake and alive. You can't live today awake and alive, and be that way for very long without being connected at some deep level to a root or a vine that is nourishing you, that is sustaining you. I just don't know how people do that without turning to addictions or you know becoming depressed or profoundly anxious. Those feel like the corners of the triangle, right? Of compulsion and addiction, anxiety, where I'm constantly in motion, or where I shut down and I'm depressed. Those are also three different responses to trauma. So this may seem really obvious, but we have to be taught. And again, I mentioned I was talking to John Eldridge last week, where he was on my podcast, and John and I are friends. And, one of the things that I'm most grateful for his writing over 25 years now, even though he's known as the guy who wrote Wild at Heart, is that he has been absolutely committed to the restoration of the heart, to us identifying our wounds, and to allowing Jesus in relationship in a community to bring wholeness. And he's given a model for that, and he teaches people. And I was asking him a question last week about experiencing God, and it was a question that I partly thought I had an answer to. And I said, why don't we experience God more? And he just basically said, we haven't been taught. And it was the most obvious but wonderful statement, because I thought, oh, that's what I do. I teach people how to listen to their body. That's that somatic awareness that you're referring to, Mel. I teach people how to listen to their own voice. And most of the time, in that lack of self-awareness or our brokenness, we either push away from trusting our own heart and our own voice, or we make it everything, right? So our voice is front and center, and by God, people ought to listen to that. So there's always three levels of connection that need to happen. And as we talk about oneness, union, communion with God, we have to remember that there's two other levels as well. And we sometimes, in that religious bypass that you referred to, we skip over. But there's connection to ourself. God. And connection to ourselves is one of the things that religious people often poo-poo or say that it's not important or that it's outright harmful for the spiritual life and we shouldn't focus on ourselves.
Yeah, just to give everybody a little heads up when they're watching this, we had some technical issues and had to completely abandon ship and get into a new boat because we were all sinking really fast. So,
That's funny.
so we are back. And Michael, if you're able to kind of recap what you just said, I don't know if it fully recorded on the other platform or not, but we only heard chops and bits, and then we'll just keep rolling and.
I have no idea what we were talking about.
I
Oh
know
my
we were
gosh.
talking about doing everybody needing to do their own work and somatic stuff and being safe to be vulnerable. Some of those things were
Yes.
on tap.
Yeah. The importance of embodied spirituality, I think, is where we left off. And I
Hmm.
love this conversation because we're just riffing. My favorite podcasts are where there's an opening question and maybe a closing question and everything in between, who knows what. But just the
That's,
importance of
yep.
embodied spirituality, that if we are not experiencing the good news in our body as good news, then there's some kind of block. And oh, I remember where we were. I was talking about how my friend and colleague John Eldridge was talking about, Michael, people haven't been taught.
Mhm.
People
There you
haven't
go.
been taught how to experience God. People have not been taught how to have a connection with themselves, and they don't even have a category for that. I'm not, so John's statement was that we've not been taught. Everything else I'm now speaking out. And so it's very important to have, in my mind, I see things in visually and I see a triangle, and at the base of the triangle is a connection to self. And then on the left-hand side, there's a connection to others. And on the right-hand side of the triangle, it's connection to God. And in that middle of the triangle, we could call that integration. An integrated human being is one who is connected to and therefore present to and therefore aware of all that is happening at any given moment, then all that is happening physically, emotionally, mentally, relationally, interpersonally, all of that is welcome. And there's nothing that is unwelcome. And I think that that's the Jesus way. When he says, let the little children come to me, there was a context there where the disciples were shooing away kids, but the larger idea is that let everything come, let everything be integrated, everything welcome. We know that what we resist will persist, said Carl Jung. So if I'm feeling anxious, if I'm feeling sad, and if I just push that down or I numb that, it's not going anywhere. I'm just not feeling it. And it will persist and it will generally come out sideways. So that connection to myself, I have to welcome. Then I can only be truly connected and present to others as I'm connected and present to myself. And I can generally only be connected and present to God to the degree that I'm present to myself. And somebody might say right now, this sounds like wonderful psychobabble. Where in the Bible does it say that? And let me just riff on Psalm 27, verse 1. As a young Christian over 40 years ago, I remember memorizing, the Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is a stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? And I would rehearse those verses like so many others where there was something I aspired to, but there was a present reality where I was like, that's not my story. What you talking about, Willis? The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not be in want. But Lord, I want so much. And that gap between what I'm experiencing and what I aspire to is what I call in sacred attachment the delta. And the delta is the Greek triangle symbol, which is in science and medicine, it's the gap or the distance between the goal and the outcome. So there's a spiritual delta between the Lord is my shepherd. I know that and I believe that, but my experience is there's a whole bunch of stuff I want and I can't say I shall not want. So what do I do with that delta? Most of us, we try to either know more, so we read our Bibles, we listen to more podcasts like this and mine, and thank goodness that people do read their Bibles and listen to podcasts. I go to more sermons. In other words, I get more knowledge. But it's not a knowledge that's experiential. It's a knowledge that's left brain. It's a knowledge that's cognitive. It's not the knowledge from the Hebrew word yada, Y-A-D-A, which is to know, which is a deep, embodied, felt experience. So I would go through that passage, and maybe 15 years ago I was reading it, and I know this is not an original idea with me, but David is saying there's one thing I ask of the Lord, this is what I seek, to dwell in the house of the Lord forever, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and seek him in his temple. And it struck me, well, what's the house of the Lord and the temple of the Lord today? It's me. It's my body. 1 Corinthians 2 tells us that do you not know that you're God's temple and that his spirit dwells within you? It's you. It's your bodies. So what if David was saying the way that I've learned and I'm learning not to be afraid in the midst of situations that are really scary is that there's one thing I've asked God, and this is what I'm seeking, that I would dwell within myself, that I would inhabit my own life, that I would not live alongside myself, as Leanne Payne used to say, the late great inner healing expert and theologian and author, but that I would live inside of my own life and be present. And as I am doing that, I'm gazing upon the beauty of the Lord and seeking him in his temple right within. And there becomes this integrated experience that's relational where I'm connected to myself. And out of that sense of self, I'm connected to God. But the problem is that most of us struggle in that place to trust on an embodied level. And that's what sacred attachment is about. That gap between what we believe and what we experience is not because we don't know enough, and it's not because we're not trying hard enough. It's because there's a wound in our heart where we never got the computer chip inside of us that learned to attach and to trust. And so this comes right back to the beginning of the conversation where we're talking about vulnerability. Trust is only formed in an infant and a child and a grade schooler, a teenager, and an adult. Trust is only formed when we are seen, soothed, safe, and secure. And if we're generally speaking seen, soothed, and safe, we'll develop a secure attachment where we can know that reliably and dependably love will be there for us. And then we literally have a neurological mechanism where we can open our heart, where we can surrender to love, to use David Benner's wonderful book title, where we can receive as well as give. And so that giving and receiving is something that can only happen when we begin to really pay attention to what's happening in our body, when we begin to pay attention to our thoughts, the voices that we hear.
Thank you for listening. And hey, if you have any questions about what Kathy shared at the beginning about our level 1 or level 2 training and a manual approach, reach out, send us an email or pigeon. What do you call that? What did they have at the carrier pigeon? However you want to get us a message.
Or go to the website. It's fine.
Yeah. Or yes. Or the tap, tap, tap they used to do. So I can't think today because I used to always
Morse
do
code.
that. Morse code. However you want to get in touch with us, do it. We'd love to hear from you. Any questions or comments, and even about the podcast too. We love hearing from listeners. But thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, and stay tuned because you want to be subscribed. Part 2, we're going to finish the conversation in a couple weeks, and you do not want to miss it. It is really, really good. And this guy is doing a lot of he's doing a lot of heavy hitting in the counseling arena and healing, emotional healing, and all of that. So please come back because you don't want to miss what's in part 2. All right, thanks for listening, you guys.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you for joining us on the Face to Face podcast. For more resources and information, please visit face2facenetwork.org.
And if you enjoyed this episode, please leave a 5-star review. It helps others discover tools for deeper connection and lasting freedom. We will see you next time.